morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Barry. I'm delighted to be here with this esteemed group of scholars and organizers and thinkers and just leaders on this issue. When we think about the economy over the past 40 years, one of the key characteristics has been increasing inequality. And there's many reasons for that proffered day after day. Largely, we hear about globalization, automation, changes in the makeup of the labor market, and declining power of unions. But we haven't talked as much about the role of consolidation in this increasing inequality. And that's really what these panelists are gonna focus on. We're gonna hear from the big picture to the small, get some sense of the abstract principles that are at work, but also the very real processes by which these changes happen. So the first person that I'm going to turn the mic over to is Simcha Barkai. He's an assistant professor at the London Business School, and he's written an important paper that's trying to understand why has labor share declined and why has capital share declined along with it. And I'm going to let him give the full explanation.
Thank you for inviting me. As an academic, I've been asked to talk about research. My research is focused on the question of why over time the labor share of income has declined. So you might want to think about the economy. You can either earn labor income, which is earned income, or you can have a form of unearned income. And over the past 30 years, the fraction of all income in the economy that's taken the form of labor income has been declining. There's another way to think about the same problem. It says, once upon a time, as workers became more productive, they produced more and more goods and services each year, their wages went up one for one with this increase in productivity. And that seems to have stopped in the 1980s. Since that period, workers continue to become more and more productive each and every year, and their wages did not keep pace. And this is a traditional classic economic problem that's been studied. And most of the ways that people have thought about this problem and approach this problem is to think about trade-offs between workers and machines. And so you have a lot of research that's trying to explain what has caused firms to stop spending money on people and instead spend this money on machines. And in my work, I offer a slightly different perspective. My claim is that we have not shifted money from one type of input into another. Instead, as a fraction of output, we're spending less on workers, we're spending less on machines, robots, and the firms are keeping the difference as profits. So again, if we want to think about what's gone on over time, workers are becoming more productive. In a traditional type of view, we would say the reason they're becoming more productive is you pair them with a lot of expensive equipment. And the difference between what they produce and what we pay them covers all this additional expensive equipment. If you go out into the data and you ask in each and every year, how much are we spending on physical capital? You would find it's going down over time. So back in 1984, for every dollar we spent on a worker, we had additional 38 cents expenditures on capital. That's the cost of financing, maintaining, purchasing the capital. And today, for a dollar we spend on a worker, we spend about 31, 32 cents on capital. You see this also across industries. When you compare those industries that are becoming more concentrated over time and those that are becoming less concentrated over time, this growing gap between how much workers produce and what they're being paid is larger in industries that have larger increases in concentration. So that's the end of my work. There's additional work out there that's studying concentration, and they find similar types of effects on investment. Those industries that are becoming more concentrated over time tend to underinvest. So not only is it not the case that we're not substituting workers for machines, the industries that are becoming more concentrated have less of both. So let me raise attention that I would like to, I don't know, this isn't a rebuttal, but something I was thinking about during the previous panel. And one of the panelists raised the issue of defensibility of a new business idea. And there's a tension here. So large firms are very, very good at what they do. They're very productive. By raising an issue of defensibility, you're saying, look, there is an existing firm who can do the same task, provide the same goods and services at a lower cost. And at the same time, there's a feeling from the panel that we don't want them to do it. We don't want Amazon to provide the same goods and services at a lower cost. And I think we understand some of the benefits. There's some of the costs that you're describing is recent work, and I'm not sure we completely understand it. So at the very least, there's this trade-off. When we think about should we allow Amazon to purchase Whole Foods, Amazon is going to reduce prices. And you can see this by stock market valuations on the day that Amazon announced the purchase. Competitors lost equity value. The stock market believes that Amazon's going to come in and going to compete for market share. So there are issues being raised about whether this is a good or bad move for consumers, for workers. My research suggests that workers have perhaps been hurt over this period, and that the amount by which they've been hurt is not a very small number. So if you ask how large are profits, and you ask how much does a typical company generate in profits per worker, we're talking about $14,000 a year. At the same time, these companies are, let me rephrase this in a slightly different manner. We want companies out there that can provide goods and services. We would also like to make sure they're facing some form of competition at the same time to make sure that they reduce their costs further and that these benefits are paid. And I think that's part of the tension that is inevitable when thinking about this problem. There are large companies. We have some feeling that they might not be good for the dynamics of the economy or for growth, and at the same time, they can provide goods and services at lower costs. And this is what we need to balance off.
Thank you so much, Simcha. Next up is Naveen Akana, and she's the director of Heal Food Alliance. She's going to be speaking specifically to the effects within the food system that we see from consolidation on workers there and some of the organizing around that.
So my name is Naveen Akana, and I'm the founding director of the Heal Food Alliance. HEAL is an acronym for Health, Environment, Agriculture, Labor. We are a multi-sector coalition that came together to build our collective power to be able to transform food and farm systems. And we were launched by a group of organizations, by the Food Chain Workers Alliance, the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, Real Food Generation, and the Union of Concerned Scientists, with this idea that by coming together across our sectors, we could transform things. And we now have about 50 member organizations that represent about 340,000 workers, as well as urban and rural producers, scientists, public health advocates, community organizers, consumers across the food system. And when we first developed our vision for change, it was grounded in the understanding that the concentration of corporate power, as well as the historic and current realities of racism, are the two pillars that uphold our industrialized food system and the harmful effects of it. And I think we can see this particularly play out with food chain workers. So it's the biggest economic sector. From farm to table, there are 21.5 million people that work in the food system, and they have 6 of the 8 worst paying jobs in this country. There's a whole lot that we could talk about exclusions and so on and what makes it that way. But the folks who work in our food system are also 1.5 times more likely to need government assistance in some way, whether that's food stamps or other kinds of subsidized healthcare or whatever else because of their low wages. And as an alliance, we're still figuring out all of our strategies and tactics to address corporate concentration, specifically through antitrust law. So we're really, really grateful to have Open Markets Institute folks and other leaders helping us think that through. So I'm happy to be here around that. And there are a lot of different aspects that we could talk about, but I wanted to, in the short amount of time, start by just uplifting one of our member organizations, the Northwest Arkansas Workers Justice Center. Some of you may know that Northwest Arkansas is where the headquarters of Walmart and Tyson both are. It's a pretty concentrated place, yeah. We all know a little bit about Walmart and how Walmart has underpaid their workers and have lower than full-time hours, so they get around paying benefits and things like that. I think it's interesting that you brought up the Amazon Whole Foods acquisition, and we're seeing that same thing play out with Whole Foods, that they're reducing hours too. But I'm going to talk more about Tyson. The Northwest Arkansas Worker Justice Center organizes Tyson workers around getting better wages, better working conditions, and you're probably aware that Tyson is one of the 4 companies that controls the beef industry as well as the poultry industry. They play a big role in the hog industry. They have operations all over the country, and their operations are undercutting producers as well as having egregious impacts on rural economies by putting producers in debt, huge environmental justice issues with the way that they pollute our waterways and our air quality, and they are really bad to their workers too. So the first time that I met a worker from Tyson, it was a worker in Iowa who talked about how he had to remove 4,000 hog hearts every day. And the repetitive stress injuries that he talked about in terms of having to stick his hands under warm water every morning to be able to even move his fingers, his shoulder injuries, those were all really horrible, but the worst thing was seeing his heart break as he was talking about the fact that he had thought that the company would take care of him, but they didn't. And they let him go instead. It was years before I understood that Tyson, as a corporation, and companies like Tyson are actually working in different states to rewrite workers' compensation laws. Right? So in 1993, they worked to pass a different way of looking at workers' compensation in Arkansas. In 2010, they made a backroom deal with the governor-elect of Iowa to change the law in Iowa. They've done the same thing in Texas and in Oregon and Mississippi and other states where they operate, so that they don't have to pay out the costs, which sometimes are as much as, I'm going to take one more minute though, which sometimes are as much as over $100 million a year, or 10% of their profits. So they're making these backroom deals, and because of that, it's no surprise that they're working to try to speed up the poultry processing line, so that because they're not going to have to be liable for the effects that it has on workers. So folks like the Northwest Arkansas Worker Justice Center, as well as UFCW, Dennis Olson is here from there. They're working to try to stop that from happening, and make sure that workers aren't having those kind of injuries on the job. It's also no surprise that they're part of the Chicken Council that is advocating for the Agricultural Guest Worker Act, Goodlatte bill, that basically relegates food and farm workers to a permanent underclass. Dennis also just informed me that they're trying to reclassify meat workers as farm workers under this bill, which basically means that meat workers will be excluded from Fair Labor Standards Act, as farm workers have been for the last 90 years since it's been in effect. So there's a lot more that I could talk about in terms of corporate concentration, how it's affecting workers, and how it's affecting our ability to organize, including the kind of kickbacks that they have with the big food service industries that make it really hard to make these changes that we want. But we'll talk more about it on the panel. I just want to end with the fact that folks are organizing, and I'm excited to be in this conversation to talk more about that with you.
Thanks so much, Navina. Next up is Tushar Sheth.
As a part of our thought process on wages and stagnation and work, we thought about merger policy. We thought about anti-competitive behavior. I'm going to talk a little bit about the things we learned and some of the challenges we saw. I think the way to look at what our administration did is a very small start to delving into the very complicated issues that everyone is talking about today, but hopefully, the folks in this room and others will have more action in the future. So in a speech last year, the Antitrust AAG at the time reminded the world that yes, labor effects are a relevant antitrust consideration. It's kind of disappointing that we have to even say that remind the world. But it was good that we did, right? Because we're seeing so many negative effects in a range of ways, but including on the conditions of work and wages. While most folks would agree that it is a relevant consideration, when we looked back at the last 30 years of challenges, which are available on DOJ's website, we could only find one instance of a merger challenge on the basis of labor effects. I can't remember the case now, but it was some hospital merger, I want to say Texas, where in that region, folks were concerned that only one hospital would employ like most of the doctors in that area. And so some carve-out was agreed to as a result of that. Now, I think there's a good reason why we may not see it in complaints, because the DOJ puts causes of action in their complaint that are the strongest. I think that's a pretty reasonable way to go about things. But when we try to think about when's the last time we discussed these issues in internal deliberations, right? We don't know what's discussed and what decisions are made, how decisions are made with respect to the, mergers that are not challenged, right? So how do we think about these things? When is the last time we talked about these things? What was discussed? we really couldn't think of an instance in recent memory. So that gives us insight into where labor and wages have fallen in the priority set. And I think we have to sort of understand these cases take major manpower. They're very difficult. We've got all these firms sort of lined up. And these are hard battles. I've spoken to friends of mine, former colleagues who are now at partner and senior level at big antitrust firms, and they have so many resources at their disposal. I mean, there's not a whole lot of fear, and so the DOJ is up against an uphill battle oftentimes. But we couldn't remember a time where, in recent memory, we talked about wages. So that's something that was important to understand and something that needs to change, frankly. When we look at the merger guidelines, the word wages, jobs, labor, work conditions, those words don't appear in the guidelines. That is the analytical framework that is used to evaluate mergers. That is how the public knows how our enforcers think about mergers. That is the transparency that exists, because we don't know the internal deliberations, like I said. The word monopsony appears once, but we don't know a whole lot about how a labor issue would be analyzed. The public deserves to know that. I'm going to talk quickly, and we can talk more on the panel, about what we thought about when we thought about anti-competitive behavior. Senator Warren talked about the tech workers case. The other sort of prominent case that many of you know about is a bunch of litigations around the country around nurse wages and collusions by hospitals, right? The story behind those cases is sort of stunning to me, and that was some of the impetus, along with a letter that Alan Kruger wrote to the president, the vice president, which was really the start of why the administration got into this, that he felt that this was an issue that wasn't thought about enough. He pointed to the nurse cases and the tech case as saying, look, we have evidence that this might be going on much more than we think, and it may be one of the factors that's contributing to wage stagnation. So that was sort of the impetus for why we were able to sort of get into this area. The wage cases, a couple of economists at Princeton did, from publicly available data, BLS and whatever, and then did some regressions to control for things like age and gender balance and occupations and cost and all of that, and compared wages of occupations across cities, and then looked for anomalies. And in the case of nurses, I'll just end quickly, I'm sorry. In the case of nurses, they've ranked cities that where do they think there might be some issues. The top 5 cities, some law firms sent investigators, and in all 5 cities, they uncovered evidence of anti-competitive behavior. That's sort of insane as a use. I mean, data, everyone's talking about data this. Data is never used in such a effective way. I mean, that's crazy to me, and that's another piece of evidence that indicates that there's more happening out there. In those cases, I think there's others in this room that might know more. 3 of them came to positive settlements. One of them might have still been going on at the time, and then one of them was not successful because of getting class cert, which we know is a difficult thing, but not because there wasn't evidence of collusion. I spoke to the named plaintiff in a case in Albany. This is after the case had settled positively. She is a nurse who had 30 years of experience. She told me, there's a handful of hospitals in town. Everyone pays the same wage out of nursing school. There's a limit on where your wage can go, so she's capped out now, even though there is still a nursing shortage in Albany, and even though every hospital is getting temp nurses. That is not, in theory, any paper you read, that is not how theory works, right? When there's a shortage, wages go up. No one sets a cap. So that's crazy that even after they were sued, after there was a settlement, this has not changed. It was really just disappointing to hear this person just talk about this, right? It's one thing to talk about it in an office. It's another thing to sort of hear it. And I'll talk when we get to questions about issues of transparency and information sharing across firms and another problem area. Thank you.
Next up, Next up, we have Sandeep Vaheesan, who is an attorney advisor at the CFPB and also has written a couple of wonderful scholarly papers on the effect of market concentration on the labor market.
So I'd like to thank Barry and the Open Markets team for inviting me, and I should say that the views I'm about to express are my own, not those of my employer. So thanks to the efforts of so many here in the audience, there's growing public recognition that there's been a multi-decade dormancy in antitrust. There's been a profound bipartisan failure to control mergers and monopolies, and as a result, we've seen increased concentration across the economy. And this concentration is, among other things, an important driver of inequality, as Simcha's work has found, and Naveen Akana and I argue in our article, Market Power and Inequality. So on the one hand, you have antitrust being relatively inactive against big capital. But in labor markets, the story is actually quite the opposite. Antitrust has been active, indeed hyperactive. Specifically, antitrust has been weaponized against workers. The federal antitrust agencies have been quite aggressive in using their power to challenge worker organizing. And unfortunately, antitrust, as in the original Gilded Age, is being used to target worker solidarity once again. I'm going to provide some quick historical background on the antitrust laws and the Sherman Act in particular. So I would argue that the legislative history of the Sherman Act is actually quite clear. The sponsors of this law did not intend for it to apply to labor. Indeed, the prevailing view at the time was antitrust law and labor organizing are complements. The federal government would use antitrust law to directly target the power of trusts and monopolies, and workers through labor organizing would build countervailing power against big capital. The Clayton Act, passed in 1914, ratified this understanding and created an express exemption for workers to band together to build power. Notwithstanding these efforts of Congress, the executive branch and the courts often use the antitrust laws to thwart labor organizing. Famously, the government used the Sherman Act to prosecute Eugene Debs over the Pullman Railway strike in 1894. Fast forwarding more than 100 years, we're seeing a troubling pattern in the intersection between antitrust and labor. I submit we're seeing a return of the Gilded Age in this area. I need to make an important legal point before discussing further. So workers who are classified as independent contractors as opposed to employees are not entitled to the antitrust exemption under the Clayton Act and face the threat of antitrust investigations and lawsuits for engaging in collective action. With the increasing classification and really misclassification of workers as independent contractors, antitrust has become a significant threat to labor organizing. So we see a tight nexus between the epidemic of misclassification of workers and antitrust being used as a weapon against workers. And the DOJ and FTC have brought a number of cases against independent contractors for banding together to build power, notably against doctors for collective bargaining against powerful private insurers, but also other less well-heeled professionals, including public defenders, electricians, music teachers, and organists. In 2015, an FTC official in a blog post put independent contractors on notice. He wrote that the commission was prepared to take action against them for engaging in collective action that did not produce offsetting consumer benefits. And the federal antitrust agency's efforts in this area extend beyond enforcement actions. They've consistently advocated against states granting collective bargaining rights to workers. So recently, the DOJ and FTC filed a brief in support of the Chamber of Commerce in its litigation challenging the City of Seattle's ordinance granting collective bargaining rights to Uber and Lyft drivers. And going back a decade, the FTC even opined against an Ohio bill that would have granted collective bargaining rights to home health workers. So it's clear that the agencies are not just targeting affluent or otherwise privileged workers, they're targeting workers across the socioeconomic spectrum. So antitrust must importantly be stepped up against monopolies and oligopolies, but it has to also be scaled back and stopped against workers. At a time of unchecked monopoly and oligopoly power, stagnating median wages, and the general erosion of labor's power, it is indefensible to use antitrust to attack workers when they seek to organize. The guiding principle going forward should be the language of the Clayton Act. It reads, "The labor of a human being is not a commodity or an article of commerce." This language sweeps broadly. It doesn't distinguish between employees and independent contractors. If we were to have an equitable distribution of wealth and power in this country again, workers must have the freedom to band together in solidarity. It is long past due for the antitrust agencies and federal courts to recognize this. Thank you.
And last, but very much not least, is Thea Lee, who is the incoming president of the Economic Policy Institute, one of the premier economic policy research and analysis think tanks here in Washington, and former Deputy Chief of Staff, Policy Director, and Chief International Economist at the AFL-CIO. So, Thea.
Thank you, Becca. And thanks to Barry and the Open Markets Institute team for bringing together this conversation. It is a really important conversation, as Barry said at the outset, to talk about the impact of concentration, consolidation on workers. And I'm thrilled to be part of this panel. Wonderful conversation so far. Looking forward to the rest of the discussion. So at the Economic Policy Institute, we've spent a couple of decades documenting wages, jobs, labor standards, the policy impact on working people of a lot of different issues. And we've talked about trade policy and the tax on workers' rights and defense of the public sector. But we haven't talked as much about monopoly. And it's true, I think, what Barry said as well, that this hasn't been one of the main concerns for unions over the last few decades. And if we're going to be truthful about it, you look back, there certainly was an era of American economic history where there was a little bit of a symbiosis between monopoly and organized labor. That some of the, I think the way economists would put it, when there is monopoly power in a sector, there are rents or extra profits that are generated, and a strong union can bargain for their share of those benefits. And if you think about the big three auto companies or the steel sector, that those are sort of the premier, massive, powerful industrial drivers of American prosperity during a certain period, and unions were right there, getting their share of that wealth. Now, that wasn't a perfect system by any means, but it was a workable bargain, a grand bargain of sorts that lasted for a couple of decades. And I think that's part of what we think of when we talk about what's good for GM is good for the economy, and I think the sense, certainly for economists, was a little bit of a laissez-faire that monopoly power is good for the middle class, it's good for innovation, it's good for growth. Consumers are getting a lot of interesting, good products. We have global domination, and it's not perfect, but it's working, and that was that picture. But that picture has changed in important ways, and that bargain has ruptured. And business broke the bargain. It's not just that business got a little bit greedy and overambitious and decided why should they share their profits with workers? Why not attack unions and workers and try to take back some of those profits for themselves? And I think that is part of the story. But it's also true you had the rise of companies like Walmart, which were enormously powerful and enormously profitable and had no intention of sharing their rents with their workers. And Walmart, as you all know, spent massive amounts of money busting unions and making sure that they weren't sharing. So you end with an explicit attack on unions led by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. More recently, state attacks on union ability to bargain and organize. And most recently with the threat that's coming through the Supreme Court in the Janus decision, which could really undermine the ability of public sector unions in particular to survive. But not just that, I think as the panel has talked about in the previous panel and the other speakers, the abandonment of antitrust enforcement led to a rise of mega market power and new technology and web platforms, particularly companies like Uber, that were very aggressive about not just not wanting a union, but not wanting employees. And I think the point that Sandeep made is really important about the misclassification that nobody's a worker. Oh, shoot. So business broke the bargain, the rise of mega power, and the extraordinary growth of inequality, which we've talked about, the concentration of wealth, which led to a concentration of political power. And I think Senator Warren spoke about that very well, too. But I think what's important when we talk about the impact on unions and workers is not just to think about the traditional sense of corporate concentration, of the market share of the top four firms, because I think what people have talked about today, vertical market power, and even cross-sectoral market power has also been important, because what we're seeing now is the class interests of concentrated corporate power manifesting itself in the political system, in political power, where there has been a systematic attack on workers' rights across the board. And it's some of the examples that were given, Navina's example about the food companies working in concert to rewrite workers' comp laws. Those aren't necessarily big companies with big market share, but they're working together because they see the same interests. The example that Senator Warren gave about non-compete. So that the concentration of political power meant that there was an attack across the board on the bargaining power of workers. And that is what led to that break that I think Simcha talked about between the growth in productivity and the stagnation of median wages. That gap is bargaining power. So I think that's the most important frame for us to think about what happened here is the attack on bargaining power. And it doesn't just come in the traditional ways that we talk about at the macro level, but also in terms of at the very granular level, individual workers being forced to sign non-compete forms, forced arbitration, giving up their right to class action and their right to be classified as employees. And let me just end with a policy conclusion, which is that, of course, while it's important, as everyone's talked about today, to address the anti-competition effects of monopoly, it's also important that we rebuild worker power and that we address the legal and the institutional obstacles to worker power because, and I think this should be interesting to folks, that if we think about it, it's not just that the impact on workers and on inequality is one of the key negative effects of concentrated and consolidated economic power, but it could be the source of one of the solutions, that if our coalition to address this problem includes workers and rebuilding worker power, then we have a winning coalition. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you all so much. I know all of you wanted to go beyond your 5 minutes, which sets us up well for a great conversation going forward. I kind of want to just start by leaping off of where Thea left off. I think there's been a strong case made that the concentration of corporations in the labor market has had this deleterious effect on wages. Workers do not have, both because of the concentration of power at the top, but also the decline of unionization for workers, do not have the power to match in their negotiations. What I want to understand is, at the same time as we've had those dynamics, we've also had increased globalization. We've had big changes in technology. What is kind of your thoughts on whether more aggressive, and this can be answered by anyone here, more aggressive antitrust enforcement can overcome that power imbalance when you still have those other factors of globalization, automation? How would antitrust enforcement be able to counter and give workers that kind of power to match companies?
I think that the antitrust enforcement is necessary but not sufficient to address these concerns for working people, because it's one thing, but as I said, to the extent that corporations are acting in their class interests, whether it's through the Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, and so on, each of the things that you named, the corporate-dominated globalization, the erosion of minimum wage, labor standards, and even macroeconomic policy, which keeps flat labor markets, less than full employment, so that workers don't have bargaining power. All of those things, what do they have in common? They are in the interest of corporations, and particularly large corporations. And one of the things that we've seen also I've been in the policy debate for 20 years on behalf of labor, is that there is, in some cases, a big diversion between the interests of multinational corporations and small companies. And the small companies care a little bit more about what happens in the United States. They care about U.S. manufacturing. Multinational corporations tend not to. So I think, the answer is yes, yes, yes. It's both. That we have to do the antitrust enforcement. We have to make sure that we're breaking up that concentration, but we can't stop there.
One thing that I'll just add to what Thea said, in agreement with that, I'll just add, I think that what the globalization of these corporations means is that we also have to have global organizing, and that we need to be working in solidarity with folks around the world, not only to defend ourselves against these corporations, but also to build the power of workers to actually own the means of production and keep that sense of sovereignty.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, antitrust is one tool among many that when we look at wages and work, monetary policy, organizing rights, all of these things. But there's a whole host of practices that have sort of been accepted as commonplace that it's unclear why we don't take them more seriously as antitrust considerations. Non-compete agreements, mandatory arbitration clauses, limiting transparency of wages, and then put alongside that union busting activities, use of temp economy and gig economy workers, all of these things. Many of these things I think are relevant antitrust considerations. I was chatting with someone, and we're not just talking about wages. This is an important point made by Stephanie from Senator Warren's staff, and others have made this point. Conditions of work, like all the sexual harassment stuff that folks are talking about right now that's been happening forever. I mean, that's part of that is like people are captive to a powerful employer and you don't have choices. Entrepreneurship comes into play, right? One of the backstops that people have is like, okay, I'll go start something that at least just provides for my family. When those opportunities don't exist in modern America, that's another choice that's not there that erodes bargaining power and so.
Yeah, I think globalization and technology have affected the entire world. And there are countries in Western and Northern Europe that have felt it more acutely than the United States has, and yet managed not to have this dramatic increase in inequality and simultaneous stagnation in wages. So I think a lot can be done at the domestic level to ensure an equitable distribution of wealth and power. And I think antitrust is one of several tools that can curtail the power of large employers and protect workers.
Let me try to respond in two ways. The recent research on growing market power, as I would describe it, or mergers and acquisitions, has indeed found large effects on things like output, prices, consumer welfare, and wages. None of these papers suggest any illegal behavior on the parts of firms. You can get all of these results without ever having a firm break a law, in which case it's a matter for public policy, but not for antitrust. To the point of technology, automation, globalization, there are clearly workers who are losing out to workers who live abroad, to robots, to machines. There are many other workers who are benefiting, people who have to maintain these robots, to build them, to code them. It doesn't look like the direct effects of technology and automation are the key culprits. If you look over the past 30 years, the period over which the labor share of income has been declining, there's no investment boom. This should be surprising to you. If the story is that these machines are taking over, you don't see firms spending lots of money on these machines. So there's another interpretation. I'm not trying to dismiss these as important roles. I think they are important. But I think one of the ways that they could work is through competition. When a firm figures out how to produce the same goods and services at a lower cost, maybe it's Apple, maybe the only way to produce a phone of such quality at such a price is to contract with Foxconn. And no other employer, no other producer can do that. And it gives them a competitive edge. And until they face competitive pressure, so it's very possible that forces of globalization, of technology, favor dominant firms, and they face less competitive pressure.
So I think 2 points were made there, though, right? You said there was an economic analysis. Why do you conclude that nothing unlawful happened? Well, from your economic analysis.
So it isn't a conclusion.
So then we should separate like legal conclusions and econ analysis. I just want to.
Yeah, so there's nothing illegal about earning profits. There's nothing illegal about earning very, very high profits. What you're not allowed to do is engage in forms of behavior that suppress competition. And I'm not claiming that there are in-depth studies that are trying to ask whether we've seen this, but I am saying that the studies that have focused on competition recently provide no evidence of illegal behavior. Antitrust policy is designed to attack illegal behavior on the parts of firms. It is very plausible that there is no legal behavior, and yet we have these outcomes that from an economic perspective are bad, are suboptimal, and they're not in general interest, and then we need other forms of policy to address them.
I think Thea wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on a couple of different fronts. First of all, Simcha, I don't disagree with you in terms of robots. I mean, the economic policy has done a lot of work on this, which is that you don't see massive increases in productivity or investment, as you say. So the idea that there's something fundamentally game-changing that's happened in terms of technology is not borne out by the data. And yet, we talk about this issue about sort of what's legal and what's illegal. I think that the truth is that we need a different set of rules or interpretations of the rules that are out there, because the anti-competitive behavior that a couple of people talked about, Sandeep talked about, and Navina talked about, and Senator Warren talked about, and Professor Zingali's talked about, which is that companies using sort of a collusive mentality to keep wages low, to prevent markets from functioning. This is an anti-competitive outcome. It's actually bad for the economy. It's not just bad for the workers, but it's definitely bad for the workers. But if we can't, and I think this is the point that Sandeep was making, if we can't figure out how to use the existing tools to protect workers who are trying to raise their voice and use collective action to protect their own interests, then we might need to look again at those rules. It's probably not going to happen in the near future, but it is something we should aspire to.
Another change we've seen in the economy in that same 40-year period has been a shift in how we think about shareholders and their role, and the way that corporate executives see their role vis-a-vis shareholders. Can any of you speak to how that interacts with the concentration of market power and how those two ideas are related?
This is one issue also we learned a little bit about in the administration, and our learning was that I think we haven't yet thought of the tools or how do we delve into this area. When you go one level up from the firm and you look at the investor level, it's often the case that one or two or three private equity firms own most of the companies in an industry. I don't know that we really have figured out how do you even take that into account. Particularly when the business model of many investment firms is to strip down costs. Typically, labor is the number one cost. And they have wage-setting power across the companies they own. I think this is an area that's not been thought about a ton. I think there's a couple strong papers out there from the last few years. But this is a real issue, right? Like in the airline industry, I mean, through mergers, there's already been like a reduction in number of companies, and then at the PE level is a handful of firms have stakes in every single one of the airlines, right? So it's an issue.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and one where if we think about the impact of concentration, you think back to sort of Econ 101, where competition sort of is like the policeman that keeps everybody honest. Like if you don't invest and you don't innovate, then somebody else will innovate and you're going to lose market share. But if you are a giant, then I think that some of the corporate governance issues and the shareholder issues can become exacerbated, and that goes to explain what I think Professor Zingalis was talking about, which is the mediocre economic outcomes that you think economists think, well, you have monopoly, at least one of the good outcomes is going to be innovation. But that there's also maybe a trajectory of concentration where a little bit of concentration may help give companies the profits to invest, and too much concentration puts you in a place where you don't need to invest and you're not going to invest, and you take all your profits, you plow them back into share buybacks and stockholder dividends, and you don't invest in capital that would actually create jobs and improve the economy.
Yeah, the shareholder value revolution has had hugely damaging effects because it effectively said two things. First, corporations should be run in the interests of one and only one group, shareholders. And secondly, that the focus should be on short-term value maximization. So businesses should be run to extract as much cash as possible to pay out through dividends and buybacks. And so for workers, the implications are workers are a cost center. They need to be shed. And this means subordinating the interests of workers to shareholders. And you see an interesting parallel in consumer welfare antitrust. So if two companies merge and fire a bunch of workers, that's treated as an efficiency because costs are saved on labor, and those cost savings, in theory, can be passed through to consumers. So you see these two intellectual trends that have really helped turn the screws on labor in our economy.
We're going to open it up to questions from the audience. I think we have time for one question.
I actually just want to make a comment while you're getting the microphone to him to the previous point about legality. I think it's really important for us, particularly in the context of how fast things are moving now, when we're thinking about what's legal and what's not, is to think about who the laws were designed to protect and to serve, and thinking throughout history that especially when we're thinking about labor, that the folks who were enslaved are basically those same jobs, like working on farms and working as domestic workers, et cetera, are the jobs that were excluded from Fair Labor Standards Act, for example, right? And that it's these corporations that continue to rewrite the laws for the sake of their own profit and productivity. And it's time for the rest of us who actually care about justice and care about communities to rethink what those laws look like and work to rewrite those in ways that actually work for all of us.
I'm certainly not advocating that this is not a public policy issue. It certainly is. And we need new answers. But it doesn't fall under antitrust. I'm not sure why antitrust is the go-to answer for some of these problems. It's something that requires a tremendous amount of consideration at the moment, and we don't know how to tackle these problems.
But that's partly what Thea was saying, whether it's a yes and yes approach.
But also, the question of whether it's an antitrust problem, it doesn't have to be the way the law is currently interpreted. It doesn't have to be interpreted that way. There's nothing in the black letter of the antitrust laws that say the consumer standard or labor. It doesn't. It's how common law has interpreted.
And I would also, quickly, sorry.
And then we're gonna, last one.
I would add that even under the impoverished consumer welfare lens we have right now, robust empirical research, most notably John Quokka's work, has shown that merger policy is failing. That agencies are allowing far too many anti-competitive mergers to go through and be consummated.
Yeah, on the matter of whether antitrust is a proper tool to use against it, I think Sandeep is absolutely right about the fissured workplace and independent contractors being a way of using antitrust against workers. But I was recently thinking about the Katz and Kruger paper about independent contractors and whether the rise of that classification was possibly driven by the Ligon decision and other precedents that are basically favorable to vertical restraints, be they price or non-price, that would enable the types of contracts that David Weil writes about in The Fissured Workplace, where you can basically, outsource the workers to another firm, force that firm to do whatever you want because you can use a vertical contract now that they're all legal thanks to Ligon and that whole jurisprudence, and meanwhile avoid all liability under labor law. So I'm wondering, especially for Thea, whether that's any work that EPI might consider doing, or whether there's any sort of interpretation of that change in antitrust jurisprudence with respect to labor.
Thanks, that's a great question, and absolutely something we would like to look further into, and it's not something I'm that familiar with in terms of exactly the way the legal interpretations on antitrust versus the employment contracts, but I think the whole concept of employers sort of divesting themselves of responsibility for what happens in their own supply chain is a key thing. And how do we put the responsibility back at the place of the ultimate employer, whether it's multinationals who go abroad and abuse workers' rights and then pretend they don't know where all their supply companies are, or whether it is even within the United States saying, okay, now the janitors don't work for us and nobody else works for us. You can walk into a hotel and everybody's a subcontractor. They're not actually an employee of that hotel chain.
Weil says, the solution to this is to vertically integrate these companies so that all the workers are under one roof. My point would be, you can basically make them all under one roof from a control perspective using these restrictive contracts like that have been allowed under antitrust, while the labor law has not extended protections to workers who are then pushed out.
I think we're out of time. We're well out of time.
We can keep going.
You guys have one more lunch.
Okay.
Thank you all so much for